evening, everyone. Thank you and welcome. My name is Brad Joya. I teach English here, and I also serve as the headmaster. And it is delightful to have such a wonderful crowd. This is the 7th year that we have had a collaboration with the Trinity Forum in St. Paul Christian School, and I love the diversity of people from Nashville that come to these events, and of course the speakers who have been here. It has been a privilege to be part of these good ideas and this great conversation. In June of this year, I traveled to Atlanta to hear Cornel West and Robert George because I wanted to make sure that both of them would be here tonight. And I heard them speak, and I thought, well, this would be a wonderful program for us. And I hope it will be the same for you. As a preamble to the program, I learned that night that Cornel West's mother entered Fisk University in 1949. And so I called Kevin Rome, the president of Fisk, and I said, you should have some Jubilee singers here tonight. Well, he said they're on vacation. Between Thanksgiving, they get off until January. However, we prevailed, and Dr. Kwame, who is the musical director of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, since 1994, I learned tonight that he and I have something in common. I've been at MBA that long. And he is also a former Fisk Jubilee singer himself. He's originally from Ghana, where he came to Fisk from. And he has arranged for Alan Christian and Andrea Jones to sing, who are alumni of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. So this is in your mother's honor. Please join me in welcoming them here on my left as they perform.
Oh Well, many thanks to our friends from Fisk for that. What a gift. That was just gorgeous. And it's hard to imagine a more beautiful way to welcome all of you to tonight's evening conversation on faithful friendship across deep difference. I'm Cherie Harder, the president of the Trinity Forum, and on behalf of all of us at the Forum, it is again our delight and our joy to be able to partner with Montgomery Bell Academy and Brad Joya, their headmaster, and St. Paul Academy and Jason Powell, their headmaster, in hosting yet another one of these evening conversations. As Brad mentioned, we are now in our 7th year of holding these semi-annual conversations here at MBA. During that time, we've tackled all manner of topics. We've grappled with poetry and beauty to just war theory, talked about whether freedom can last and how to care for our common culture, discussed what Augustine has to tell us about politics, and what C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien can tell us about friendship. And each time we have sold out at the Dead Poets Society here at MBA. But as Brad alluded to, tonight is a special night, and a larger venue was needed. And I think it's a testament both to the interest in the topic itself, as well as the admiration for our speakers tonight, that we have again sold out in this much larger auditorium. So I'd like to thank all of the sponsors who have made tonight possible. Our individual sponsors, Lee and Mary Barfield, Gary and Susan Dean, Reagan and Jessica Farr, Matt and Paige Kisber, Ed and Molly Powell, and Giff and Anna Thornton. the foundations that have helped to underwrite these costs, including the Beasley Family Foundation, the Cheris Foundation, and the Creed and Culture Fund, as well as our corporate sponsors, including the Sims Funk Law Firm, GAW Properties, and Polsinelli PC with John Peterson. In addition to our sponsors, I'd like to recognize a few of our trustees who have joined us this evening, including our chairman of the board, Byron Smith, Sam Funk, and Doug Wilson, who flew in from Indianapolis to join us this evening. But of course, we're also delighted that each and every one of you are here. And because we've sold out, we know that there are many people who wanted to come tonight, but for one reason or the other could not make it. And if that happens to describe someone you know, fear not, there are options. We'll be live streaming tonight on MBA's platform, so you can tune in there, or your friends can tune in there. We'll also have video up on our website at www.ttf.org, as well as our YouTube channel. And pics and video clips will be up almost immediately on Facebook as well. We also know there are a number of first-time attendees in the audience and want to send a special welcome to you. And for those of you who may be here for the first time and are not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for the discussion of life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and other publications which draw upon the classic works of the humanities that explore enduring questions and connect the wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs such as the one tonight, which helps connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging the big questions of life. And ultimately, our hope is that they will come to better know the author of the answers. And one of those great questions, which seems particularly urgent in our increasingly polarized, angry, and alienated time, is how we both live out our deepest convictions and live together as neighbors, friends, and fellow citizens. It's a challenge that has always been at the heart of the American experiment. But it's not merely a political or civic challenge, but for many of us, a keenly felt personal one. As over the last few years, perhaps in particular, there are many relationships that have been strained and even severed as people's disagreements have bled into what was once a solid friendship. Indeed, our identities have grown increasingly political, while our politics has grown more angry and apocalyptic. We see the fallout in the decline of support for freedom of speech and religious liberty, the success of Twitter trolls in shaming and silencing, the eagerness to distort and demonize, and the substitution of denunciation for debate. And as our inability to deal with difference is growing, so is our diversity. We are rapidly becoming a more religiously, ideologically, ethnically, and politically diverse nation. Yet our technologies have enabled us to self-sort along financial, educational, and political lines. It grows ever easier to confine our socializing, our conversations, even our news feeds, to those with whom we already agree, who mirror our preferences and confirm our biases. We are left unpracticed and increasingly unable to deal with difference wisely and well, even as our need to do so grows ever greater and more acute. So at a time when our public conversation is increasingly marked by animosity and anxiety, and political differences seem so deep and the stakes so high, how do we address difference with both courage and kindness? How do we pursue and preserve relationship with those with whom we disagree? Can we sustain a deep friendship across difference? These are certainly difficult questions, and there are no easy answers. But it is hard to imagine two people who have wrestled more deeply or wisely with these questions, or better embody and model a way forward than our speakers tonight. Often called an ideological odd couple, Professor Cornel West and Professor Robert George may have little in common politically, ideologically, or even stylistically. But they share a deep friendship a common faith, and a long-standing commitment and collaboration to encourage, in their own words, the cultivation and practices of the virtues of intellectual humility, openness of mind, and above all, love of truth. Dr. Cornel West is the inaugural Laney Professor of the Practice of Public Philosophy at Harvard University and holds the title of Professor Emeritus at Princeton. He graduated from Harvard in 3 years and obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton. He has written more than 20 books and edited another 13, including Race Matters, Democracy Matters, his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud, and his recent work, Black Prophetic Fire. In addition to his incredible scholarly attainments, he's also produced 3 spoken word albums and made his film debut in The Matrix, and has appeared in over 25 documentaries and films. We'll also hear from Professor Robert George. Professor George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the Director of the James Madison Program at Princeton University. He's also served as the Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, as well as on the President's Commission on Bioethics, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, a U.S. member of UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Science and Technology, has also, like his good friend Cornel West, written quite a number of books, including Making Men Moral, In Defense of Natural Law, The Clash of Orthodoxies, Conscience and Its Enemies, and many others. He holds an MTS and JD degrees from Harvard, a DPhil, BCL, and DCL degrees from Oxford, and 19 honorary degrees, and has also received the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal. I'll ask Professors Cornel West and Professors Robbie George to join me up here on stage. We'll hear brief opening remarks first from Robbie George, followed by Cornel West, and then we'll have a moderated conversation between the 3 of us before opening it up to audience questions. Dr. West and Dr. George, welcome. Cornel, turn this on. Robbie and Cornel, we are so excited to have you here. And in the process of just doing a little bit of research before we hosted you, it seems like whenever one Googles both of your names, the term ideological odd couple comes up. So I wanted to ask you first just how you got to be friends in the first place, and in addition to that, how your friendship has changed the way you think and your work.
Well, Sharif, first, thank you for having us here. Thanks to the Veritas Forum, to Montgomery Bell Academy and St. Paul Christian Academy. It's really an honor to be here in Nashville. And I would say that even if I weren't a country music fan and a banjo picker. But I am, which makes it a special pleasure to be in Nashville. And related to that, we're so honored, Cornel and I are pointing right at him, to have the great country music legend, one of the people who built the country music industry, Stan Hitchcock, and his wife Denise with us tonight. And seated right next to them, Brother Cornel, is our dear friend, our sister Carol Swain. Carol is here. Carol and Cornel and I go back a long way together when we were together at Princeton at the beginning of the late 1980s. I also believe that we've got a group of people here from Union University. Are there some students from Union University here? Am I wrong about that? Yeah, up there? Yeah, good. Well, I want to welcome them. Union's a very special place for me. I'm an honorary alumnus. I'm honored to be of Union. And I know some of the Union students who are here are guests of a wonderful, brilliant friend of mine who wanted to host a group of Union students here today. And so I'm really delighted to have the Union people, and I know she is as well, with us. So Cherie asked how we got to be friends. Well, in the 90s, we were professors together at Princeton. We didn't know each other very well, but we did know each other. We were together in some faculty seminars. Carol, you were probably with us over in the Center for Human Values in those days. We had some wonderful faculty seminars, usually about questions of philosophy, political theory, history. Although we didn't know each other very well, and I was the lonely conservative in the crowd. Carol hadn't yet outed herself, I think, or maybe come completely around. I noticed something about this brother right here. While he usually got the answers wrong, he was asking all the right questions. Nobody else could get the questions right. And I grew up in the hills of West Virginia. Even I had enough sense to realize if you're going to get the right answers, you got to get the right questions first. So Cornel was 3/4 of the way there, asking exactly the right questions when other people were missing them. So I learned to admire him for his intellect. I later came to know him not only as a man of great intellect, but a man of enormous integrity. So I have great moral admiration for my brother as well. But one day, about 2006, I got a knock on my door during office hours from a student, a wonderful student of mine. He had been in my constitutional interpretation class, named Andrew Perlmutter, who said, "Professor George, I'm here to talk with you about a new project that I'm involved with called the Green Light Magazine. It's going to be a new magazine of arts, culture, literature, politics here on our campus at Princeton." And I said, "That's great." And he said, "Well, I've also studied with Professor Cornel West, and I really enjoyed his courses. And as part of our program for our magazine, in each issue, we're going to have a feature, an interview of one professor by another professor." And so he said, "We've reached out to Professor West to ask him if he would be the interviewer for the first issue. And we asked him to tell us who he'd like to interview. And he said he'd like to interview you. Would you be willing to be interviewed by Professor West?" Now, Andrew was a religion major, was in your department. Brilliant kid. So I was very flattered. And I said to Andrew, "Let me make sure I understand this. So you said to Professor West he could interview anybody he wanted, and he said he'd like to interview me?" And Andrew said yes. And I said, "I want you to send a message back to Professor West. I want you to tell Professor West that Professor George says, but it is I who should be seeking baptism from you." To which this religion major, brilliant kid says, "Huh?" And I said, "You just tell Professor West what I said." And he said, "Okay, I'll tell him, but will you do it?" And I said, "Well, of course I'll do it. I'd be absolutely honored to do it." So the appointed day came, and Andrew came along, and there was a photographer. Remember that photographer? He was snapping those pictures. He must have taken 2,000 pictures. It was up in my office in Corwin Hall at Princeton. And he turned on that tape recorder. We had an hour's worth of tape. He turned on that tape recorder, and Cornel and I just started going at it. It wasn't an interview. My goodness, it was a wrestling match like you've never seen before. And finally, we ran out of tape, but by that point, it was too late. I mean, we were in it. So what was supposed to be a 1-hour interview went to 2 hours, went to 3 hours, went to 4 hours. That photographer's still snapping. Andrew's still sitting there. He's out of tape, but he's listening. And so finally, we must start about 2 o'clock. Finally, I noticed on my watch, it was about 6 o'clock. And I said, "Well, Brother Cornel, this has been wonderful, but, look at how late it is. I'm going to have to go home to dinner. I'm sure you are too. But, we got to know each other better. This has really been a rich conversation. Let's get together for lunch. Let's get closer acquainted." And he said, "Oh, Brother Robbie, that'd be wonderful. Let's do that for sure." And I said, "Why don't you just park down in the parking lot here by the University Press? Walk me down." So we walked down together, and then I stood there with my hand on the door latch for another 45 minutes. We kept going at it. Well, that same week, just coincidentally, we got a note. Some of the senior members of the faculty got a note from the dean of the college saying that we have this wonderful freshman seminar program at Princeton. We're very proud of it, and we advertise it, especially to prospective students. I think we have some prospective students here tonight. We try to get them to come to Princeton rather than Vanderbilt by telling them that if you come here, you're going to get to study right off the bat, even as freshmen, with some of our most famous distinguished faculty members. And the trouble is we don't have enough senior faculty members who are actually signing up. So please, will you sign up to teach these freshman seminars? Well, the light bulb went off over my head. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to do a seminar that's just a continuation of that conversation with Cornel? We'd co-teach it. And we'd have these 16 bright, young Princeton freshmen with us, and maybe we could do it on a great books basis. So I got in touch with Cornel, and he immediately said, that would be a wonderful thing to do, Brother Robbie. Let's tell the dean we'll do it. So we did. And we designed the seminar. We wanted it to be a seminar based on great books. Sophocles' Antigone, Plato's Gorgias, St. Augustine's Confessions, all the way up to the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, 20th century, John Dewey, C.S. Lewis, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, Leo Strauss, with no secondary sources, so that the students are not learning what other people say about these great texts, but are actually wrestling with the authors, wrestling with the ideas in the texts. And we just do one book a week, so we could just keep focused, very, very tightly focused on the text. And I thought that they should be books, and Cornel agreed, that we ourselves had wrestled with. It had been important in our own intellectual journey. So he picked 6 and I picked 6. Turns out we like the same books. That's probably the basis of our friendship. We like the same books.
That's true.
We certainly wrestle with the same ideas. And it was just a fantastic experience. We would get together, have dinner before each seminar, and we began to realize that despite our rather flagrant political, ideological differences, we have an awful lot in common: a love of ideas, a commitment to truth-seeking, an understanding that truth-seeking is not something you can do in a closed-minded, self-righteous way. It requires intellectual humility, willingness to engage another person, willingness to consider that you're sometimes wrong, that understand that you're fallible, understand that truth-seeking is a mutual process, a joint process, and that when you're in even an intense debate with a fellow truth-seeker, whatever your differences are, you've got something more fundamental than those differences that's driving you, and that's a desire to get at the truth of the matter. We both were formed by Plato, reading Socrates, reading about Socrates' engagement, learning that Socratic method, that Socratic attitude, the Socratic virtues when it comes to truth-seeking. We also discovered that we share deep Christian faith, the belief that each and every member of the human family, irrespective of age or race or anything else, is a precious child of God, made in the very image and likeness of the divine ruler and creator of the universe. I'll let you know a secret: not everybody in academia believes that. But the two of us found out that we did, and you sort of start to bond. Now the other thing is, he's just so lovable. How can you not love him, right? So I mean, we formed a deep friendship as a result of that, and pretty soon our families were getting together. I've got Cornel's daughter, my honorary niece Zaytun, who's at Princeton with me now. She could have gone to Harvard where Daddy was, but she made the right decision. She came to Princeton, and we have a good time together. We were with her just the other evening when we did a program at Princeton for the freshmen and their families. So that's how the magic happened. And then at that point, we just decided we're going to keep doing this, not always with freshmen, teaching seminars on that great books basis, wrestling with great texts for upper class students. We did that until Cornel abandoned me and went up to Harvard, and I'm still trying to forgive him for that, because forgiveness is a virtue. And then we started doing things like doing some writing together. In 2017, we put out our statement on truth-seeking, democracy, and freedom of thought and expression. And there, Cherie, we were really trying to address that problem of ideological tribalism that you put your finger on, and that's such a danger to democracy today. We tried to point out that whether You're talking about the health and well-being of the academy, and by the academy, I don't just mean universities. I mean Montgomery Bell Academy, and I mean middle schools, and I mean public schools, and I mean private schools. You know, throughout academic life, we're seeing this unwillingness to engage competing points of view, and unwillingness to listen to people who disagree with you. This is toxic to truth-seeking, which is the whole mission of academic institutions, whether we're talking about kindergarten or we're talking about graduate school. So we're trying to address that, but also to show that these same values of intellectual humility, open-mindedness, willing to listen, understand that you can be wrong about things, you're human, you're fallible, that you need to learn from people who disagree with you, that those same values are necessary to support a democracy. You know, in a democracy, fellow citizens are going to disagree about things, but they need to be bound together by principles, including principles about how we go about disagreeing with each other, respectfully, civilly, with an understanding of the humanity of the other person, who is not an enemy to be defeated, but who's a friend with you in the truth-seeking process, looking for the common good, even though you might reach different conclusions. Cornel and I might reach different conclusions about whether the government ought to run the healthcare system, or how much should be the responsibility of civil society and how much should be the responsibility of the state, how much market, how much government. You can disagree about those things. Reasonable people of goodwill do disagree about those things. But when they disagree about those things, if we're going to do this and if we're going to sustain the democracy, we have to understand that we have to respect each other. We have to engage each other. We have to be willing to listen to each other, and we have to be willing to learn from each other. End of sermon. My brother.
No, but that's strong. No, that's very strong. No, and he's told the story. He's told it with eloquence in terms of how we came together. But I first want to begin by saluting you, my dear Sherry, for your leadership. And I want to salute Brother Brad, 25 years of service to this grand institution. And we're praying for your bounce back, my brother. You're strong as ever. And to bring the artists, they already did. No, but we can still hear their voices. But I want to acknowledge the artists, because for me, you see, in my life, given my fallible view of things, that art is in no way ornamental or decorative. It's constitutive of who I am. It's integral to who I am. Not just the music, but the plays, the novels, the poems, the sculpture. In some ways, the artists are the vanguard of the species in terms of their willingness. Put forward vision, courage. And any time an artist creates an art object, they authorize a different world, a different reality. That's utopian energy, projecting possibility. And so very much in our conversations is that sense of being committed to something bigger than ourselves. And I don't know whether my dear sister Centoya is here, but the Centoya Brown Long was one of the grand citizens of this place. I was just with her.
Oh, yeah.
Well, just stand up, my dear sister. Stand up, let's give it. Where is she? Oh, there she is, yeah. And Brother Jamie there too. Brother Jamie, stand up, Brother Jamie. Brother John Yoder. All three of them. I didn't realize they were here to make it. No, this is my dear sister Centoya, who was oh, but your mother, your blessed mother made it too. Yes, indeed. No, I've met her in Dartmouth. She was just such a brilliant and kind and loving human being. Wrote that powerful text that's becoming a bestseller. And I was told there was a chance you'd be here, so I just wanted to acknowledge you and the magnificent work that you're doing for us for good. It has everything to do with what we're here. Because I begin with my brother, who I have a deep love for. And love is in no way reducible to politics. I fight with tremendous tenacity for his right to be wrong. And not only that, but we overlap in significant ways, not just in terms of our common humanity, our common love of ideas, the fact that we try to be true to the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem and the Socratic legacy of Athens. The latter self-criticism, self-scrutiny, that intellectual humility, intellectual integrity. And yet at the same time, we know Socrates never cries, he never sheds a tear. Jesus weeps. Something deeper is going on. Not just love of wisdom in the abstract, but love of mama, daddy, grandmama, granddaddy. Jesus weeps because he loves so. Not just love of wisdom, he loves other human beings and all of their fleshiness and fallenness. And for Brother Robbie and I, we believe in the fusion of this tradition. The best of Socrates, the best of Jesus. Now, of course, Jesus never laughs. And Robbie and I laugh a lot. But G.K. Chesterton, one of the greatest of Christian intellectuals in barbaric 20th century, used to argue that Jesus hides his mirth because laughter has everything to do with the human connection of each and every one of us that cuts so much deeper than our skin pigmentation, our class, our sexual orientation, our national identity. We're internationalists in terms of every human being in every nation has that sanctity and that dignity made in the image and likeness of God. Now, granted, when we think about Fisk University, I do want to say a word about my mother and how this connects to who I am, because my mother met my father in front of Jubilee Hall. So I would not be without Jubilee. Oh yeah. In the very literal sense, I would not exist without that Jubilee Hall and those Jubilee singers who sang in order to keep that hall going. And then the towering figures of W. Du Bois's and the Lucius Outlaws and philosophy and Nicky Giovanni's and poetry that come through a tradition whose anthem of black people is lift every voice. It's not lift every echo. That's crucial. Echo chambers. Extensions of echo chambers. Might make a lot of money, might gain access to status, it may help your career. It is damaging to the soul. What does it profit a man or a woman to gain the whole world and lose your soul? Voice is something deeper. Can't be a jazz woman or a jazz man. You can't be a Hank Williams without finding your voice. You're not just imitating others. You're not just emulating those who came before. You're digging in the dark corners of your own soul and trying to transfigure that suffering into an expression that is distinctly you, just like your fingerprint. Only you. That is an endless process. So this prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, it goes through Amos and Esther on through Jesus. And yes, it goes on to Muhammad too. Our Islamic brothers and sisters, our Muslim brothers and sisters are part of the legacy of Jerusalem. We just have theological differences. Those three world historic religions grounded in the genius of Hebrew scripture. And then the pre-modern pagans, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And any Christian has to acknowledge honestly to him or herself the ways in which that legacy is intertwined in a Christian understanding, be it the Koine Greek of the New Testament, be it Paul himself, you see, all the way through the Enlightenment, Romanticism, the American experiment in democracy, and most importantly, the spiritual dimension of saying to be human is to engage in sweet surrender to something greater than you, wise dependence on something that was in place before you arrived, and a joyful gratitude of gifts of grace over which you have no control. Those three crucial pillars that sit at the very center of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And we all fall short. We try again, fail again, and fail better. In the language of that lapsed Protestant Samuel Beckett. From Ireland, yes, but Protestant in Ireland, lapsed Why? Because even though he's an agnostic, an atheist, it depends on which day of the week. Because his favorite word was perhaps, so he just didn't know. Perhaps is right. Perhaps you just don't know. That intellectual humility at work. But what we need now at this particular moment in this social experiment, this political experiment called the USA, with all of its strengths and all of its weaknesses, is an attempt to recover the sources of the best of the past that allow us to revel in each other's humanity at a deep level, even given our disagreements and agreements, recognizing that we're concerned with something bigger than us. And we can begin with the precious children, the precious students at this institution, and at St. Paul's as well. The children on all sides of Nashville, the chocolate side and the vanilla side, the brown side, the yellow side, and I know there's some indigenous peoples in Nashville too. You see, all of them human beings. And how do we sustain a connection such that we can keep a very fragile experiment in democracy alive against the backdrop of unbelievable impending ecological catastrophe and economic catastrophe for poor and working people too often. The spiritual catastrophe of losing the ability to even want to live a life of integrity, honesty, decency, and generosity. The triumph of Thrasymachus, might makes right. The triumph of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's great novel, The Brothers Karamazov, in which it's all about manipulation and domination. That's nihilism. We're living in nihilistic times, and the most powerful force on the globe these days is nihilism in various forms. You see it in Hungary, you see it in India, neo-fascist movements, hatred, contempt, unbelievable indifference. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It's powerful insight. Powerful insight. And the sad thing is we're passing this on to our children. They don't see enough exemplars of people who are trying to push back the hatred, the contempt, the envy, the resentment. They don't see enough examples of integrity, honesty, decency. When I was coming along, all I needed to do was look up and see Martin Luther King Jr. See not a perfect man, see a fallen human being, but he was talking about, we have been a people who have been hated for 400 years and taught the world so much about love. We've been terrorized, but we taught the world so much about liberty. We didn't terrorize back. Black folk could have had a black version of the Ku Klux Klan. If so, there would have been a civil war every generation. Instead, it was Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells and Martin Luther King Jr. In the face of so much trauma, we're going to teach you a little healing. Listen to a little Aretha Franklin. Listen to John Coltrane's Love Supreme. Listen to a little Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles. And he's going to go country too, though. Didn't he? Go say he went country, though, didn't he? Because he knew it was a human thing. Listen to this healing from a people who have been so traumatized. 244 years of white supremacist slavery and 100 years of American terrorism and the lynching that took place every 2.5 days for 50 years. What is it about the best of these people? I'm not talking about the gangsters and the thugs. Every group has gangsters and thugs. Black, white, red, yellow, whatever. But we talking about the best. And what we try to do with our young folk is say, we have the audacity to say that you can be in contact with the best. So when you come in this class, what do we tell them? You come to learn how to die. And they say, I thought we was just trying to get a grade for our...
They're lying.
That's true. No, I'm trying to get my curriculum vitae in place. I've got to get a job this summer. Now, in this class,
Learn how to die.
you're going to learn how to die in order to learn how to live. That's Montaigne. To philosophize is to learn how to die. Or Seneca, he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. You see, and that's Seneca, a Roman. We don't expect too much profundity out of the Romans. They run an empire. They're not thinking deep like the Greeks, but even still, you never know. You got to be open to all groups, all civilizations in this way. But it's a serious issue because we tell them we're learning how to die together, even as we disagree.
Let me ask you both.
Let me just add one thing to what Cornel said here, because I want to wrap up the ending. It's so important, and it's so critical to what we do, and it's really at the foundation of our friendship, because it's the work that we do together.
Right.
We're trying to teach, might not even be the right word, inculcate in our students a desire to live an examined life.
That's right.
And that's what we as adults need to, whether we are teachers or scholars or not, parents, grandparents, we need to be the examples of living an examined life. What is an examined life? It is a life that asks what's important, what really matters. Mm-hmm. Young people think, and this may not be just something that happened yesterday, maybe this is a long-standing thing, I don't know. But a lot of young people think what matters is being a celebrity, being a star. What matters is wealth, status, power, influence. Now, what we try to tell our students is those aren't bad things in themselves, because you can do good things with them. Wealthy people have undoubtedly built Montgomery Bell. They built Princeton University, I can tell you that for sure. They built Harvard University. The generosity of wealthy people was important and has been important, especially in America. I mean, we really have benefited enormously from that. Wealth isn't bad in itself, nor is power. Power can be used for good, can be used for ill, which shows you that it's not good in itself. It depends on what you do with it. Status is good. We don't tell our students, don't try to achieve social standing. Influence is good depending on how you use it, but none of those things are what ultimately matters, because they're all means, they're not ends. They're not what, they are things you do things with. They're instrumental goods, not what's intrinsically valuable. The examined life is about what's intrinsically valuable. Now, the real danger with getting focused so much on the means that you treat them as their ends is that that's where the enslavement comes from. And it's the worst, the most abject form of slavery, because it's not slavery under the influence of another. It's being a slave to your own passions and desires, your own wayward lusts, your own feelings and needs. The master, the person who's a master of himself, is the person who is able to transcend all that, because he knows there's something more important. He's living for something greater than power, influence, status, and so forth. So that's what it's, from our point of view, what it's all about. It's about the examined life. But how often, frankly, do students see grown-ups, whether it's in the media or just in their own personal lives, who are leading examined lives? So often the example is being set as a bad example. That what matters is celebrity, what matters is power, what matters is wealth, what matters is influence, what matters is status. We've got to do better than that. And the heritage of this civilization is fundamentally a Christian heritage. And if Christianity stands for anything, it's for that self-mastery, that rejection of slavery. I'll use the old-fashioned language. Slavery to sin, slavery to passion, wayward passion, that has trapped so many of us today. And is it any surprise that our young people get caught up in it, with all the dreadful consequences, especially for those who are the most vulnerable? Who gets hit the hardest? The weakest, the most vulnerable.
I'd like to ask you both about the concept of civility, and that I think both of you are known for both incredible intellectual ferocity over the truth as you see it, combined with great personal warmth. And it seems like the very concept of civility is under attack on both left and right. by people who believe that it's a form of squishiness, a dispensable secondary virtue that can inhibit the full-throated pursuit of what is right, or that civility itself has been weaponized to essentially be a protector of the status quo and a bulwark against necessary social justice. So I'd like to ask both of you how you navigate that and what your view of the concept of civility is.
That's a wonderful question, because civility's never been one of my favorite words. It really hasn't. It goes back to citizen, and I take that term very seriously. No democracy without citizens. You remember Aristotle's definition of a democracy. A citizen is capable of being ruled or ruled. So there's always a rotation of rule. That's what democracy is about. And accountability of those who rule. But the reason why I've always been a little suspicious of it, because, see, as a revolutionary Christian, I'm concerned about the moral and spiritual work that a word does. And civility for me has always been too thin. You see, I want citizens who try to be kind to one another, gentle to one another, sweet to one another. And kind and gentle and sweet cut at a different register for me than civility. And hence you get critiques of civility. Oh, you're just hiding, it's a charade. You're just wearing a mask, you're not really being yourself. You're simply putting on a certain kind of show. Whereas when you're really kind, it's got to be for real, or it's just not the real thing. If you're really sweet, people can make, see, we're not talking about polite. Polite is more on the civility side. I'm talking about real kindness, sweetness, tenderness. You know, Otis Redding said, try a little tenderness. I mean, that's not try a little civility. So that Robbie and I, we've never really been civil to one another. You know what I mean? I love the brother. He's kind, he's sweet, he's gentle, and he's honest. So when you're honest with somebody, you get upset with them when you think they're wrong. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I get upset with my mother. You know what I mean? She's 87 years young. But I'll take a bullet for her in the heart in a minute. You see? So it seems to me that Christians have to have a perspective that gets deeper than some of these secular constructs. Because so many of these secular constructs were themselves the residue of what came before. It's like Hume on benevolence, because he lost his Presbyterian faith and gave up on love talk. You say, okay, benevolence in a secular context, we understand that, but it'd be nice if everybody really tried to love each other on a deep level and failed and bounced back every day. That's really what we're talking about. Let's just be honest about it. And I prefer that kind of language rather than, but what do you think? Am I being too hard on it?
I think
on that word.
I think a little bit.
In which way?
Yeah. Language shifts in meaning over time.
That's true. That's true.
I'll give you a very good example. In Aristotle, the term eudaimonia used to be translated, if you look at all the 19th century and early 20th century translations, it used to be translated as happiness. Fundamentally for Aristotle, what ethics is about is the pursuit of eudaimonia, formerly translated as happiness. Well, what Aristotle means isn't having a smile on your face that might be induced by Darvon, is that the pill, or some drug, or by being hooked up to an experience machine, or something. He doesn't mean a pleasant psychological state. He means rather fulfillment, all-round well-being. The best translation today would be flourishing. So why did they say happiness? It's because even as recently as 100 years ago, happiness had that morally inflected quality. It didn't just mean a psychological state that might be induced by drugs or being put on some sort of a machine or something like that. It meant what we mean today by fulfillment, a kind of all-around flourishing. You still get a sense of that when you realize that you know exactly what I'm talking about. If I would use old-fashioned language by saying something like, happy the man who walks in the way of justice. When I say that, you realize I'm not just saying, hey, if you walk in the way of justice, it'll be, just like you took drugs and have a smile on your face now. You realize I'm saying something that's morally inflected. Blessed is the man, flourishing is the man who walks in the way of justice. So terms shift. And I think what's happened to the term civility is some of its core meaning has been washed out with time in the way the word happiness has lost some of its richness, some of its core meaning over time. It's been reduced just to a psychological state. So today, too often, if we use the term civility, people will interpret it in the way Cornel was explaining. It's a very thin kind of a concept. In fact, people might say being civil is when you sit there listening politely, politeness again, politely, while another person expresses a view. Well, you're being tolerant, you're letting the person, you're not interrupting, you're not calling the person names, you're not grabbing a lamp and smacking them over the head with it or anything like that. So you're listening, but you're being civil, but you're not engaging that person. With a rich meaning of civility, what civility should mean and what it used to mean is not that you're sitting there politely letting him talk. It means you're listening seriously to what he has to say. You're considering maybe there might be some truth in it. You're considering that maybe his critique of your view could have some merit. You're trying to hear it in the most favorable light to give it the benefit of the doubt, to see whether you could learn something from it. Whether or not the argument changes your mind, you might nevertheless learn something from it. So whether you use the term civility or not, what Cornel and I are after is that deep, rich listening. Not just being tolerant, not just being polite, not like you have your say, I'm going to have my say, then you have your say, then I have my say. It's actually trying to engage and listen to each other so that you can learn from each other. Now, you only do that on the assumption that you have something to learn. And the trouble today is people think they don't have anything to learn, they already know it all. And so they're perfectly content to only listen to radio or only watch TV or only read newspapers that are going to reinforce what they say. One of the problems with all the diversity we have now in our media culture, one of the problems is if you're on the conservative side and you only want, as I am, and you only want to be reinforced in your conservative views, you can do that. You can watch Fox News, you can listen to Rush Limbaugh on the radio station, you can read the Wall Street Journal editorial page or read National Review. You don't have to hear anybody else. Same thing on the progressive side. If you just want to be reinforced because you have nothing to learn, you just want to be told that you're right already all the time, you watch MSNBC or CNN, you read the New York Times, I don't know what radio stations you people listen to.
I mean, we don't have that radio station. That's part of what it is. There is no leftist version of Brother Rush Limbaugh at all.
There used to be, but anyway, you see the point that I'm making. You know, we're not. That's a fair. If you're doing that, stop, because you're making a false supposition. You're assuming you don't have something to learn from people who have basic disagreements with you about policy matters. And you do have something to learn. I do. Cornel does. We all have something to learn. Because here, I'm going to tell you the following truth about everybody in this room, and everybody in this town, everybody in this country, and everybody on this globe. Here's something interesting about all of us. Now, you tell me if I'm wrong. Every single one of us currently has, right there sitting in his or her head, some false beliefs. I do. I have some. He does. Sure he does. You do. So you say, well, then why don't you change them? It's because you don't know which ones they are. Everything you believe is true. But if I ask you, do you have no false belief? Are you sure? Do you really think you have no false belief? You'd say no. Of course, I know I'm wrong about some things because I have the experience of changing my mind. And I know that won't be the last time I change my minds about things. Now, since we know some of the beliefs we have are false, and probably not just the trivial and superficial ones, but beliefs about important matters, if we know some of what we believe is false, how are we going to get that changed? How are we going to reduce the number of false beliefs and increase the number of true beliefs? I can only think of one really good way: by listening to arguments being made by people or evidence being presented by people who see it differently than you do. And that's not a matter of just sitting quietly and letting him talk. I have to listen to him, to listen to you. I have to be willing to really seriously consider that maybe you're right about this and I'm wrong about this, or I have something to learn at least.
So before we go to audience questions, one quick follow-up to that, which is you've been talking a lot about recapturing a shared moral vocabulary. But recently, The Atlantic magazine said that America has largely responded to the challenges of diversity by pushing moral language out of public life. And in fact, one of the speakers that we had in this very auditorium, David Brooks, did a fascinating study using Google InWords to show how public language had changed over the decades. And what has gone out are the virtue words: courage, bravery, kindness.
Wow, courage.
What has increased are words of commerce, words of celebrity, and I-oriented words. So in your united desire to reintroduce a shared moral vocabulary in the country across diverse lines and across difference, what guidance would you give to educators, to parents, to others who would like to be part of recapturing a shared moral vocabulary?
I think we have to be quite candid and robust about insisting that there be moral conversation in public space. Moral conversation, again, that cuts across the board, not just one conception of morality and one moral view or code, but to enter that public space without humiliation and engage in intense moral argument, contestation, agreement, and disagreement. Because if you push out the moral and the spiritual, and all that takes over are commerce language, or the language of market. He said, I'll never forget 1980. I was there when they deregulated television. We said, well, what about the children? They said, well, TV will take care of the children. No, markets don't take care of children. Markets can do a lot of things. Bread, peanut butter and jelly, goods and services, but markets cannot raise children. I wrote a book called The War Against Parents, and the argument was, parenting is the ultimate non-market activity in a marketing culture. So you don't make a financial calculation of having kids. You better get ready for some deep sacrifice. Now, I'm not just talking about financial, I'm talking about time, energy, and so forth. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Christian discourse is not really tied to pleasure or happiness. It's joy. Joy is the fruit of the Christian life. What is the difference between joy and happiness? Well, that's another issue. We don't have time to get into it, though, but there's a sense that we've got to have a space. When we went to the Air Force Academy, it was very interesting, because one of the things we could presuppose was that the commercial mentality is not predominant among them. They are trained to be engaged in martial activity. So then we come in as Christians and say, we're soldiers too. We're not fighting the same war all the time. Sometimes I'll disagree with the war that the government puts forward, but I'm still on a battlefield. Now, when William James wrote one of the last essays he wrote before he dropped dead in 1910 called The Moral Equivalent of War, and he was building on another genius named Jane Addams. She had debated, they both had debated that year before. You see. This sense of being able to engage in combat, spiritual combat, moral combat. Life is a battlefield. There's no doubt about that. But it can't be conceived simply in martial terms tied to money as the effect and consequence, money as a reward, but rather the virtues, the values, the visions that allow us to leave some kind of witness in that battlefield. You know, when I used to go to vacation Bible school, and I'll never forget, Sarah Ray told me, Brother Cornel, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. And that heaven that you're leaving is in a world that is shot through with so much grimness and bleakness and hatred and domination, and yet you're in that world but not of it. And so you're on a battlefield. You're contending all the time in that way. And I think, I don't know what the conclusion that Brother Brooks raised. I've read both of his books, and I detect his own transformation.
Yeah, he's had a journey.
He's had a fascinating journey in that way, from the transactional to the transformational, as he would put it in some ways, you know. But I think it's inside of all of us, these market sensibilities, obsession with success. We tell our students all the time, this is about moral and spiritual greatness, not just about financial success, not just about pecuniary success.
I would not draw a contrast between the market and morality, or the military and morality, or the government and morality. My plea would be for moral and spiritual concerns to suffuse our activities in all of those domains.
That's true. That's true.
It's not good moral advice to say business is an amoral enterprise, therefore you shouldn't do that. The really higher calling is academia.
No, don't tell them that.
Or the clergy, or something like that.
There's human beings in each one of those activities.
I think what we need to recover is the idea of vocation. There's some lovely sisters here from there they are up there, our Dominican sisters who are up there. They'll know what I'm talking about. Vocation is not just about what those sisters in their beautiful white habits do or what clergy do. Vocations are something all of us have. Cornel and I have the vocation of scholar and teacher. The vocations in the academic life. Stan had vocation in music and entertainment, in entertaining people, giving them some joy in their lives at the Grand Ole Opry and places like that. These wonderful singers from Fisk, the same. They've got a vocation, or at least that's part of their vocation. Well, business is a vocation too. And we shouldn't be telling our young people who aspire to business that, well, they're aspiring to an inferior activity or an amoral activity or one that's only concerned about values that are apart from the spiritual. No. What makes the difference? What is a vocation? What makes something a vocation? It means you're doing it as a way of serving, and business can be a wonderful vocation. Just as wealth can be used for wonderful things like supporting institutions like Montgomery, Bell, and St. Paul's and Harvard and Vanderbilt and Princeton. There are good things that you can do with money. There are good things that you do in business, in the way you treat your employees, in the way you treat each other, in producing high quality products and services. Now, there are dangers as well. There's some things that shouldn't be for sale. There's price gouging, there's predatory lending, there are bad things that need to be regulated, the way markets need to be regulated. All that's true. But what we need is a return to the idea that these values, these moral concerns really should suffuse. And Cornel was right to say it's not just moral but spiritual as well. When we were young scholars, and Carol will remember this as well.
She's much younger than we are.
Yeah, that's true. The dominant school of political theory by far, leading figure of which was the great John Rawls from Harvard. The dominant theory was in those days called liberalism. And it was a theory that tried to push spiritual concerns, religious concerns, and to some extent moral concerns as far to the edges of public life as possible. There was a noble reason for that. I was against it, Cornel was against it, we were agreed on this. But there was a noble concern. The concern was spiritual values, moral values are deeply contested, they're divisive. In a democracy, if we debate those, if we fight about those, if those become the object of democratic deliberation and judgment and choice, we'll blow the whole thing up. It'll blow apart. For the sake of social peace, we've got to marginalize the moral and spiritual concerns. I knew that was a mistake from the start. I understand and agree with the concern, but it's not the way to go. Now, political theory academic political theory has largely moved beyond that, and I think rightfully so. In those days, a lot of people press the idea that our own Constitution, our American Constitution, should be interpreted in a way that would privatize religion, marginalize it, push it to the edges of public life. To the extent possible, make it something for the home, around the dinner table when we say our grace, or on our knees at bedtime, or in the church or the temple, the synagogue, mosque, but not in public life. You're all familiar with this. That's a mistake. That's a mistake. Yes, religious issues, yes, moral issues can be divisive, but they're critical. They can't be marginalized. You're going to end up making crucial decisions about them, one way or another. The question is, are you going to do it openly and with a true civil discourse, Or is it going to be done through the back door, pretending it's not what you're doing, where you're actually imposing values on people, claiming that you're doing something else, claiming that you're being neutral or merely technocratic? And the reason is that in no democracy, really in no society, can we create a situation where all we have are technical issues to solve, technocratic issues to solve, where all we need are well-trained managers from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, or the Kennedy School at Harvard, or Stanford Business School, or Columbia Business School, or the University of Chicago. The issues of life, including social life, are moral issues. They're unavoidably so. They're not all reducible to technical, non-moral, non-spiritual solutions. So let's learn to persuasive as they can be, with grace, with civility, with kindness, with openness, but argue about them. Make them the substance of what we're debating.
In our remaining time, we'd like to hear from you. So I'd like to welcome to the podium Jason Powell, the headmaster of St. Paul Academy and one of our partners in this effort, to both kick off and moderate the question time from the audience. Jake.
Thank you, gentlemen. Wonderful, wonderful things to consider. And as someone who spends my days fighting and fighting hard for the importance of what we do at St. Paul Christian Academy, academic excellence, a passion for Christ, and leadership development, you're a commercial for that, because that's what we do, is to help our students see the world from a perspective of depth and meaning. And as I'm thinking here, my colleague Brad and I, 13 years from now, students will pass. They're in kindergarten today at St. Paul Christian Academy. Some of our boys will pass here to Montgomery Bell Academy, and they'll be at Princeton, and they'll be at Harvard in 13 short years. What's the one attribute you would like us to make sure when we talk about a mission of leadership development, an attribute, a thought pattern, or a behavior that we work with our families and our children so that when they enter your campuses, they're ready for the stuff that you've shared with tonight?
Just one.
Yeah, that's that.
Boy, that's tough.
Well, there's two of us, so we can give them two.
So that's right.
Oh, now that's nice. So we should huddle. We should huddle and see which one we want. A division of labor here. Because I want compassion and courage together, though. But I guess you can't really love unless you have courage to love.
That's true.
So let's just say a phrase: courage to love.
Okay. Someone once said the strength to love.
Oh, Martin Luther King himself.
Okay,
That's right.
okay, thank you.
That's right.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
right.
you very much.
But Brother Ryan,
Let me give you another one. Here's what I want you to send me, at least. I'm sure Cornel thinks as I do on this. Send us independent thinkers. Young men and women who will think for themselves. What we have too much of today, and this is with our super overachievers, nearly perfect SAT scores, valedictorian, Princeton, we get these wonderful kids. They're unbelievably talented. Their achievements are extraordinary, and yet conformist in their thinking, caught up in the groupthink. They come to us that way. Parents used to worry that they'll come to college and the professors will indoctrinate them. We don't have to indoctrinate them. They come pre-indoctrinated.
Thank you.
Give us independent thinkers, kids who know how to think for themselves.
And they're connected, you see, because the courage to love is the courage to love truth, love
That's
goodness,
it.
love beauty, love God, love neighbor. And even as a Christian, you got to learn how to love your enemy. You can't do that by yourself.
Independent thinkers with the courage to love. Thank you, gentlemen, for that. Well, I'm going to give instructions to our audience. We have 3 microphones positioned and 3 rules. I listened tonight, so instead of be civil, I'm going to say be kind. Be brief. And ask a question in the form of a question.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
And I think to the audience's right, we'll begin with the gentleman at the microphone there.
Thank you all for being here. I want to raise an issue, and it may be something that you can demonstrate how to talk through this civilly together. One of the issues in society right now is the whole transgender movement going on. We're seeing that break out in our schools, in our athletics, in our colleges, in our high schools. And Professor George, you in fact wrote an article that was released yesterday about how it's even got into our courtrooms in custody battles. So can you tell us, one, why has that jumped to this big issue in our society? Where did that come from? And how do we civilly discuss that whole issue, which includes sexual liberty and religious liberty in those issues?
Well, it's a very important issue today, and the article to which you kindly referred is one that I wrote with my former student Ryan Anderson. It appears in the online journal Public Discourse, so you could easily find it if you're interested in it. For those of us, and here I count myself, who are critical of transgender ideology, usually because we're critical of sexual revolutionary ideology more generally, it's very important to make very clear from the start that persons who experience gender dysphoria, including those who self-identify as the opposite sex, and including those who undergo treatments, hormonal treatments, or surgical treatments to create the appearance of being the other sex. Those persons are precious human beings made in the image and likeness of God like anybody else and deserve to be treated with love and compassion. We must be in the forefront of ensuring that such people are protected from teasing, bullying, being called names, being labeled things like freak. We should be utterly intolerant of any of that kind of dehumanizing stuff. And then we make our argument. But the second thing is, those of us, again, on my side of this issue, need to understand that we cannot be and must not permit ourselves to be intimidated into silence. If, as we believe, a great deal for precious human beings depends on avoiding buying into that ideology, then it is up to us to muster the courage to get the kind of pushback and hatred and animosity and name-calling and professional risk that comes when you say, I'm not on board with this. I think there are problems with this. So we need to have that kind of courage as well. And again, we need to listen. Because guess what? I may feel very strongly about this. As a matter of fact, I do. I mean, pretty firmly convinced. I've done a lot of research on this subject. I'm pretty firmly convinced that I've got the right position here. But I'm fallible. I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, the only way I'm going to learn that I'm wrong is to listen to people who are making the argument on the other side. And again, not just politely letting them speak, but hearing what they have to say, including the testimony of people who themselves have had this experience with dysphorias and who have embraced it. Just as we should listen to people who've had the experience of dysphoria, who've embraced transgenderism and then regretted it and turned around. When Cornel says lift every voice, there's no more important subject on which every voice needs to be heard today than that one. Cornel?
No, I mean, first, what Brother Robbie said at the very beginning to me is crucial, that my basic Christian sensibility is to always be in solidarity with the least of these, at 25th chapter of Matthew. I don't fully grasp or understand what's going on or what the cause is. I just know that these trans folk are precious, priceless, and are to be protected in their preciousness and pricelessness. Now, at the same time, I then have to have some sense of what it is to be able to be in close connection. I'll give you an example. When my dear brother Larry Wachowski, who made The Matrix, and we went down to Australia and did it, then next time I met him, he was Laura. And I said, oh, this is fascinating transformation. I said, what's going on? And we said, we talked about it. I said, teach me. I want to know what's going on. But this is in his case as opposed to a whole host of other cases. So it builds on what Robbie first said. And even though I would have a response to Robbie in terms of even using the word ideology, I'm not sure ideology fully captures that kind of transformation that he underwent. it could be he was influenced by maybe an ideology, but there's all these other elements that I don't really grasp. But that was true for me as a straight brother, given my precious gay brothers and lesbian sisters. My first interaction with gay brothers was, God, you got to help me understand. Well, read some Gore Vidal. Okay, all right. Read some James Baldwin. Read some Evelyn Waugh. There's experiences out there that I don't fully grasp, even as we take our various stands based on our understandings of our traditions and so forth and so on, and come out in different places. But it's that first section that I want to stress, that the first portion of what Brother Robbie had to say in this regard, because what happens is we've got so much hatred and demonizing already out there, and it just escalates. And it's so easy to hate the most weak and vulnerable and invincible. And it's true that trans folk these days are being, they're being killed, they're being trashed, they're being violated, and so forth and so on. And based on what Brother Robbie said at the very beginning, all of us must intervene when we have that kind of demonization taking place.
Thank you both. We're going to go. All the way to the microphone in the front on the audience's left, and we have time for a question there, and I think that's going to be our final question. Unfortunately, wish we had 4 more hours, like the 1-hour interview that became
we can go a little longer if you like. Is that all right?
I think we'll take a couple more questions.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right.
But we intend to be much shorter tonight.
Be brief applies to the askers and
Absolutely.
the answers. Okay. We'll start here.
I'll be brief real quick. What's the most significant issue that you've changed your mind about? And what's the most significant issue that you're still undecided about? With the emphasis on being a significant issue, not a trivial one, just really significant.
It's a good question. Because we've had some very intense fights over abortion. And certainly there's been some learning, I think, on both sides, and the moral passion behind it, and how you go about determining when that precious, priceless little one is viewed as person, early on, at what point, and so on and so forth. And it's also true in terms of text. I think I read Hayek in a very different way after teaching with my brother. And texts for me are very important because they inform how we understand some of these crucial issues. So just very briefly, I'll just try out those examples.
I've had 2 important transformations in my life. First was the movement from the more liberal side of the spectrum over to the conservative side. So as I say, I grew up in the hills of West Virginia. Both of my grandfathers were coal miners. We were strong Democrats in West Virginia. Not only did we not like Republicans, we didn't know any. I mean, there was we were Union people. We were Franklin Delano Roosevelt people. There was Jesus Christ, and he was ahead of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but not by much. I mean, it was right up there. John L. Lewis, the United Mine Workers of America took the coal miners out on strike during the war. So I came from a strong Democratic family. I regarded myself when I headed off to college as a pretty orthodox liberal. I attended the Democratic National Convention, the one that nominated President Carter in, I guess, '76, as an alternate delegate. I was twice elected chairman of the West Virginia Democratic Youth Conference. That was the younger Democrats than the young Democrat. And then when I got off to college, instead of doing what I'm told most kids do, or I guess what most kids are told to do, which is move left, I zagged when they said zig, right? So I ended up in a different place. I became a lot more skeptical of large-scale government programs, in part because of my experience in Appalachia. I also learned a good deal more about things that went on in the Union, in the Democratic Party, and I became more critical. The second was an intellectual conversion. These are not completely unrelated. It was during my sophomore year in college when I read Plato's Gorgias, the dialogue Gorgias, and that fundamentally changed the direction of my life and set me on the path of my vocation as a scholar and teacher. Up until that point, I now say I wouldn't have been able to perceive this at the time. I wasn't leading anything even remotely like an examined life. I stood for what I stood for because it was what our tribe, our group, our party, our family, our tradition stood for. What I aspired to was social standing, being important, having influence, things like that. Just didn't know any better. But that encounter I had with that ancient Greek just fundamentally transformed me when it came to that. In my work with Cornel, I was just reporting this to a couple of the youngsters here who are with the newspaper and the podcast, where Cornel's thought has had a big impact on me is on questions of race. I had, until a few years ago, been inclined to think that racial division has been such a catastrophe for this country. It has been so awful, especially given the fact that race actually doesn't exist. There's no such thing as race, right? We reify these things. But it's just been such a terrible disaster for the country, and we still can't get rid of it. We still can't. My inclination was to think that the problem is race consciousness, and our awareness of racial identities is what keeps us from overcoming race. So let's just have a completely colorblind society, and let's get rid of racial consciousness or racial identity altogether. That seemed to me like a reasonable solution. But of course, what I've learned from engaging with Cornel about these sorts of issues is that whatever is to be said about race as an ontological category, and here I am skeptical that there's anything that really answers to the word, there is a sense in which the history of race, especially in our country, and of racism in our country, and of racial oppression in our country, going all the way back to slavery and then Jim Crow and the terror that was involved there, what that's done is give rise to a sort of what could be called a culture. There is an African-American culture, an African-American tradition. That doesn't mean that African-Americans are anything other than full regular Americans, any more than the fact that there's a Jewish culture and a Jewish tradition would mean that our Jewish neighbors are not really full Americans. But that tradition is a tradition of art. It's a tradition of music. It's a tradition of literature. It's a tradition of political thought. It's a tradition of family relationships. It's Duke Ellington, and it's James Baldwin, and it's W.E.B. Du Bois, and it is Frederick Douglass, which is not to say that any of those figures only belong to African Americans. They belong to America, and therefore to all Americans. To white, to Asian Americans, Americans who got here yesterday, as much as to African Americans who've been here or brought over on slave ships. And yet there's a special sense in which that's the culture. When Cornel says something like, I belong to a people who have suffered oppression for 400 years, I know what he's talking about. That particular people, that particular culture. And the pride that he takes in that, the relationship that he feels to that, which doesn't take away from his relationship with people who are from a different sort of American culture, but that pride he takes, that understanding he has of himself, is identified with that. That is not something we should get rid of. It would not solve our problems just to say, let's just stop thinking of ourselves in racial categories. Now, when it comes to matters of public policy, when race should be taken into account or shouldn't be taken into account, my opinions on that have changed very little, if at all. I mean, I think when it comes to policy matters, we should be as colorblind as we possibly can. We should treat people as individuals to the extent that we can, not as members of groups. So that's not that there's some big political difference there, but it's a difference in something that's very important that I failed to see, I think, until we really started talking about these issues, just out of ignorance. I thought there was a kind of quick solution to the thing. Just stop thinking in terms of race. Just stop having racial consciousness or racial categories. I now see that is really, wouldn't even be good to do. We can't do it. It's not going to happen. But we shouldn't do it.
Thank you, and we're going to have a question on the left side. Gentlemen, yes, sir.
Thank you. I want to thank you for tonight. I want to thank you for using the word vocation. I don't think you used identity. I don't think you used career. And it also made me think of Al Fisk and Howard Thurman, who in a previous generation, white and black, founded Church of All Peoples in San Francisco in 1954, interracial church.
Right. Yeah.
He defined vocation, Thurman, as don't ask what the world can do, what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is people who come alive. I wonder how you define vocation. That would be very helpful maybe to this discourse.
It's a wonderful question. I'm glad you invoked the great Howard Thurman, the genius of Howard Thurman, who was, of course, the mentor and teacher of Martin Luther King Jr., the close friend of Benjamin Mays. I think serious reflection on vocation, it begins with the two essays about Max Weber. Politics as vocation, science as vocation. Going back to Martin Luther's talk about Beruf, just German sense of being called, the sense of being touched in such a way that there's something inside of you that won't allow you to hold your peace on the inside, that fire. Whatever that vocation is, Emerson's American scholar, he democratizes it. He says vocation is not just a religious one, it's not just for a relation of human beings to God, as in Martin Luther. In America, it is every person, the centrality of ordinary people, each one having their certain calling, following their moral passions, not just their feelings. Passions that have been cultivated with a connection to a tradition that makes you wrestle with what it means to be human and how the best of you can be brought out. So again, it's very different in career, it's very different than livelihood. It's your sense of purpose and mission on this globe in your short trek from your mama's womb to tomb. You see? And that's something that's hard because again, career, profession, other than vocation. What are you going to do with your life? I'm going to, and somebody talks about what job they have. No, I don't want to hear what your job is. I want to know what kind of person you're going to be. What you're going to do with the job you got. Don't tell me about how you're going to be successful. What are you going to do with your success? Don't tell me about your foliage. Tell me about your fruits. To get biblical, you know what I
mean? Vocation is fundamentally about service.
Yes.
That's why if you're treating your job just as a job, well, then it's not a vocation. It's just a way of earning money. If you're treating your job as a vocation, or if you understand your job as part of your vocation, the way you understand being a husband or being a wife, being a father, being a mother, it's part of the vocation. You realize you are there serving. It's a way of serving. I'll illustrate it with a story that Stan Hitchcock told to me some years ago. Stan was when Stan was a young person, got his chance to go on to the Grand Ole Opry, and he sang his first song, and the audience loved it and were stamping their feet and clapping their hands and wanting more. And Stan, just a young kid, out there with his guitar and feeling like he was on top of the world. And Roy Acuff said, "They want more, Stan. Give him an encore." Man, did he feel like he was going to be a big star, which he ended up becoming. But on that evening, something happened. Those of you who know the Opry and know Acuff know that Acuff had a dobro player, Bashful Brother Oswald. And well, it turned out that Bashful Brother had been over to Tootsie's. I think you know what Tootsie's is.
Now tell me about Tootsie's.
Tootsie's work at Lounge.
Oh, okay, all right.
And he got himself fueled up over there a bit.
I got you.
And he had wore these big old fake clown shoes. And He had come back to the Opry, and just as Stan was about to give him the encore, Bashful Brother came running across the stage in his sort of clown costume, with his big shoes, and hit a skid and slid and off the stage and right into the lap of a 300-pound lady from Ohio who was there in the front row. And of course, the audience just roared with laughter. But it ate up Stan's encore. And he was forgotten about as the crowd just enjoyed what they thought was a deliberate bit of comedy, which was nothing of the kind. So Stan was a bit brokenhearted over the whole thing. Now Acuff gave him some advice after the show. Acuff came and he said, "Son, when Bashful Brothers sobers up here, he's going to be very sorry about what he did and that he stepped on your encore in that way. But I want you to think about this. You know, there are a whole lot of people in this audience tonight who came on this Saturday night and they worked hard all week, hard-working people, and they'd paid their 50 cents to come and enjoy an evening of musical entertainment, the music they love. And you were part of that. You helped to make that a big evening for those people who were here. You just take pride in that. What Acuff was telling him effectively was, you got to understand your role here, not as just a job. And the aim is not just celebrity. You're serving people. The hardworking people who came for a Saturday night, paid their 50 cents, and were there in the audience. That's what we do. We're serving. And that's true not just of musicians, obviously, and not just of sisters and priests and clergymen and rabbis. It's true of all of us, and what we do as teachers, is what we do as business people, is what we do in the medical field as nurses or doctors, health professionals, and so forth. We're serving people. Sometimes it's a way of making a living, sometimes a very good living. But it's a way of serving, and that's the most fundamental thing about it. So we need to encourage young people to see their roles in life in vocational terms. The real question they should be asking is not how can I make the most money, how can I have the biggest influence, how can I have the most status. Those things aren't bad, but still those aren't what's ultimate, not what's really important. How can I serve?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We're going to go with one final question.
Thanks. Is it possible to have a conversation about civility or civil discourse that claims honesty or integrity without talking about power dynamics that might govern that discourse or govern any interactions that we have? And do you feel like the conversation tonight properly interrogated those sorts of power dynamics? Thanks.
Well, I appreciate the question. No, I think Socratic commitment to intellectual honesty and integrity means you have to be able to interrogate any set of forces, including the power dynamics that are at work. Now, power, of course, comes in a lot of different forms. It's economic power, political power, discursive power. We were talking very much about moral and spiritual power, so we were still talking about power. But the question becomes, how then do you begin with the primacy of the moral and spiritual and connect it to systemic analyses of economic, political, imperial, white supremacist, male supremacist, homophobic forms of power that historically have demonized folk in this way. So that I appreciate your question. I think the important thing is to acknowledge the ways in which any commitment to intellectual integrity forces us to deal precisely with the things that are hidden and concealed, usually unsettling and unnerving to people, but done in such a way that the dialogue goes on. Because if it's Thrasymachus, as you remember in Plato's Republic, right? He says what he has to say, and he's ready to leave. Remember that? And Glaucon and the others are saying, well, wait. Socrates respond to him. And Thrasymachus is ready to go. Well, you say you can't shut the dialogue down. Thrasymachus wanted to leave. And of course, usually folk who are shutting the dialogue are folk who at that moment do have more political and economic power. You see? I mean, in the U.S. Congress, when they had the what was the name of that, the gag rule where you couldn't even raise the issue of slavery? You see, that meant that the slaveholders didn't want a dialogue on the dynamics of economic political power as related to white supremacist slavery and so forth. And you can go from one context to the next. No, you've got to be Socratic across the board. You've got to lift the voices. And so I'm glad you raised that question, and it may have been the case that we didn't get a chance to spend as much time on talking just about the economic and political powers, which are crucial. I would say imperial powers in terms of empires and so forth, you see. But at the same time, if there's no concern with the moral and spiritual quality of the persons and the issues, then you're going to end up with a lot of sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. Because it's going to end up with just the victors take all, the powerful win, and we're walking down the Nietzschean road to chaos. And I would say even a certain kind of immorality. And I have a great respect for Friedrich Nietzsche. He's just wrong on most things. That's all. A lot of respect for him. He's the brook of fire through which you pass. You don't get stuck there, but you got to come to terms with it. But it's will to power, crush the weak, the exact opposite of what we learned from Esther and Amos and Jesus and Muhammad, on to those who are concerned about the weak in whatever form it is. And I'm sure that you identify with that solidarity with folk who are suffering part of that same legacy that we're talking about. But that's the beginning of an answer to your question, my brother. Did you want to say a word about it?
Yeah, I want to begin by agreeing with what Cornel said at the beginning about the importance of having the question of power dynamics and power relationships on the table in discussions, including discussions about civil discourse, and in our discourse. That's true, it has to be there. But I want to issue a warning. The greatest crimes of human history, the greatest monstrosities, the greatest inhumanities have been perpetrated in the name of standing up for the weak, for the downtrodden, for the poor, who in the system are victimized by procedural concerns like concerns with freedom of speech, with dialogue, with open discussion. The arguments that the Mao Zedongs and the Stalins always make is that those so-called liberal values are just mechanisms by which the powerful continue to oppress the weak. And therefore we can get rid of them, we can cast them aside in the name of actually substantively protecting the weak. And the next thing you know, we have terror famines and the liquidation of the kulaks and the murders of so many people in places like China and Russia that even Hitler looks like a piker.
Do you feel like that applies to what you would identify as the left right now in the United States?
No, what I'm saying is I'm issuing a warning. Do not think that the way forward, that the way of humanity eliminates civil discourse, freedom of speech, the inclusion of all voices. I want the left to be Cornel's left. It's the left that says, lift every voice, include every voice, have every topic on the table, including the topic of power dynamics. Cornel was interviewed by Al Jazeera. I saw you.
Oh, just the other day.
Just the other day.
Yeah. I forgot I did
and
that.
The Al Jazeera interviewer was raising a question interestingly like yours. The interviewer knew that Professor West is a harsh critic of former President Obama. And so he put it to Cornel that Barack Obama recently criticized the woke left for its cancel culture and for its violations of free speech and its willingness to ride roughshod over those old-fashioned liberal values in order to reach egalitarian goals that the woke left wants. Now, the Al Jazeera interviewer clearly wanted Cornel to criticize President Obama. But Cornel's answer was a very clear and ringing, I'm against cancel culture. I don't think anybody should be canceled. If the left is going to be about canceling people, no matter who they are, then I'm not part of that. I want dialogue, not counsel. Now that can be a very tough position. Because Cornel's saying, when he says, I don't want to cancel anybody, that means not even canceling the neo-Nazi, whom Cornel stood nose to nose, literally nose to nose, this close.
That's true,
in Charlottesville. You're this close, weren't you?
I was close. It was close.
Yeah.
It was close now. Oh, yeah, we were close. Oh, me and that neo-Nazi brothers could have sang a duet together.
but here's what Cornel had to say about it. I'll fight him with everything I've got. I'll fight against what he stands for with everything I've got. But he's a human being, right? There's something there to work with. He's not ready to dialogue, but I'm ready to dialogue with him. We need to move him to a position where he's prepared to dialogue. I'm not even canceling him out. I'm not even writing him off as somebody who is utterly irredeemable, who can never be brought round. But if we're going to bring him round, we're going to have to obey some rules. We're going to have some standards. We can't just treat this as a sheer matter of cancellation. We're killing people.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And in fact, to make sure that you, my dear brother, make sure you never cancel. Make sure your voice is never just dismissed as if it doesn't have moral content, intellectual quality, and so forth and so on, you see. And so that's one of the commitments to a sense of morality and spirituality that cuts across the grain before you even get into the nitty-gritty. And the nitty-gritty are some of the very concrete disagreements you have. Because we've got some issues out there that are very, very intense. And there's going to be, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to reach some kind of agreement. Well, that's how life is. I mean, there's always going to be liberals, conservatives, left wing, right wing, and so forth. That's who we are as a species. So we decide either to be a jazz orchestra and lift your voice and hope that somehow they can be brought together in such a way that we don't kill each other, or just authoritarian, despotic, and that's de-escalating force we began with. That's nihilistic. That's just power in its economic, military, and political forms across the board. And that would mean we couldn't have these dialogues like this between he and I. No, not in the neo-fascist America. You couldn't have these kind of dialogue. We would have been drawn off the stage a long time ago. This brother's critique of Donald Trump would have sent him to jail. And he's a conservative, yeah, but he's a conservative who has a disagreement with a president in the White House. And if there was a full-blown neo-fascism, he's going to jail. I'm going with him. As a revolutionary Christian with my progressive politics, I'm going with the brother too. We sing in jail. We bring Brother Stan with us. We bring Brother Stanley with us, singing too.
Dr. West, Dr. George, Robbie,
I think there are just terribly important lessons we have to learn from the history of the greatest catastrophes in human history. We have to learn from the realities of especially European fascism. We have to learn from the realities of communism in places like Russia and in China today, in North Korea, in Vietnam. These tragedies happen when people think to get to places we need to reach economically, or in terms of social justice, to get where we need to be, we're going to have to dismiss these boring old traditional procedural concerns like rule of law, like freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, freedom of the press, rights of association, due process.
That's right.
But those are so critical. They're what stand between us and the gulag, what stand between us and the concentration camp. And they protect everybody.
Very fragile, absolutely.
And independent thinkers with the strength of love.
Yep, there you go.
That's a good point. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Cherie has some final words.
Absolutely. Dr. West, Dr. George, thank you so much on that mic drop moment. As we wrap up, we want to leave you with some recommendations, an invitation, and of course some Thanksgiving. Some recommendations we have. have right outside this room, we'll have copies of both Dr. West and Dr. George's books for sale. We'd recommend Race Matters. The 25th anniversary edition is out there, and Dr. George's book, Mind, Heart, and Soul, is available for sale as well. We highly commend both to you. You'll notice that both Dr. West and Dr. George talked about the importance of text throughout this evening. And on the back of your program, we have 3 recommendations that shed light on some of the themes that we discussed today. We have a Trinity Forum reading on friendship by Cicero, George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, which explores the importance of words, as well as selections from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. We've essentially excerpted some of the richest part of these larger texts. We hope it will whet your appetite for more. We are confident that you will find it well worth your while to read. We also want to leave you with an invitation. In addition to your programs, you should each have a small invitation to join the Trinity Forum Society. We'd love for you to be part of the community that helps make events like this possible and pushes back in a modest but potent way against a culture awash in triviality, sensationalism, trolling, the language of dominance. We try to provide a place and resources for leaders to grapple with what matters most and to better know the author of all of the answers to the questions that we grapple with in a way that is both intellectually rigorous and warmly hospitable. We believe it may be small, but it is a powerful way to embody and to spread a more thoughtful, gentler, and kinder culture. And we hope that you'll be part of that society, which makes it possible. There's also, of course, several benefits to doing that, including the fact that you'll receive our quarterly readings, which include many of the authors that Dr. West and Dr. George talked about, including Augustine, Aquinas, Dostoevsky, Martin Luther King Jr., Mandela, and others. And I'm sure you'll find those of great interest. That's in addition to our daily What We're Reading list of reading recommendations and our monthly upcoming podcast. And in addition to that, as a special benefit, if you join tonight, we will give you all 3 of the reading recommendations that we mentioned for free, just to jumpstart you. If you are interested in being a sponsor of an event like tonight, we would love to talk with you. Please feel free to talk with me, talk to Byron Smith, Brad Joya, or Jason Powell, or my able colleague, Alyssa Abraham, who is around here somewhere. Maybe you can wave, that's fantastic. We also hope that you'll join us for future evening conversations, which will start again in the spring. Finally, as we wrap up and as we head into the holidays, it is always appropriate to end with thanks. And an evening like this, there were many people whose hard work behind the scenes helped make it possible. I'd love to thank again our partners, Brad Joya and his able team at the Montgomery Bell Academy, Jason Powell and his Cracker Jack staff at St. Paul Academy, and my own colleagues here, Alyssa Abraham and Hannah Smith. Would also like to thank our volunteers, Alan, Amy, Luke, and Joel Spires. We had a whole family help us out. Lauren Hester, Ashley Larmer, Beth West, Susan Cobb, and Jeanette Leggett. Our videographers, Barry McAllister and Mark Addison, and our photographer, Allison Adkins. I want to add particular thanks to our extraordinary chairman of the board, Byron Smith, whose fingerprints have been all over not only tonight, but the entire series. We are indebted to him. Finally, thank you again to Dr. George and Dr. West for an extraordinary conversation. So enjoyed it.
Thank you, Reverend.